I want to welcome everyone here to the class tonight, and we'll begin with a blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commands and commands us to engross ourselves in the words of Torah. All right. Tonight we're going to finish off chapter 10 in talking about the defeat of the southern kings. And so here we are right now. This is the spot where we're at in the chapters. And so I'll just leave that up so that you'll know kind of what we've got going into. Next week we'll be looking at the northern campaign and how that goes. And so all right, now I've added this little. I thought this was a neat little. I don't know what you'd call it, graphic that shows the track that Joshua took in his battle on the southern front there, and kind of what it looks like from the topography of it all. And how that. Remember last week where we talked about going from Gilgal, which was down over here, to up to Gibeon, about 20 miles there, and it was all uphill. Everything was uphill, and they did all of that at night with a full moon. And so by doing that, then they were able to surprise the enemy and catch them on a bad omen day. So anyway, I just thought this was kind of an interesting little map here. And you know how I am with maps. I like maps, and then when they're 3D like this, a topographical map, it's even more better. All right. So anyway, are there any comments or questions from last week before we get going? Remember, if you have a comment or a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself, and just speak away, because it's not like I was in a class this morning with my yeshiva where there were 88 people on there. And at times they were trying to talk across each other, and so we'd have to just stop and it was also being translated into Spanish. So it took a great deal of patience, let's say, to get through that. But here, with only eight or nine of us, we don't have to worry about that. So if there are any questions or comments, just jump right in there and comment or question. Okay, so let's go ahead with this. Now, these 5 kings fled and hid themselves in the cave at Makeda. And so it was reported to Joshua, the 5 kings are found hidden in the cave at Makeda. And so these guys, these kings, they had allied themselves together to fight Israel, and now they avoided death on the battlefield. They avoided capture. I mean, basically they hid themselves. So they ended up going into a cave with no way out, evidently, and they were discovered, and so that made for an easy capture. So, and they also avoided the hailstones that fell. You remember those, what we talked about, hailstones that killed more of the enemy than the Israelites did with their swords. So that was definitely a divine intervention to kill off the enemy before they could kill you. And so they, evidently, I would say that God had a different ending for these guys than what what, by dying gloriously on the battlefield. That's one thing. And no, God said, no, we're not going to do that. And so I looked all over, with Rabbi Google and Rabbi uh, YouTube to see if I could find the actual cave and where Makeda was. And it's very elusive, because supposedly there was some professor that said that, okay, he had found the Makeda and found the cave, but then the rascal went ahead and he died. And so that's what happens a lot of times. These guys say, I found it, and then they die. And so that proves to me, I am not going to Israel and go around and try to find stuff and say, I found it, because I'm not ready to die yet. So, but anyway, the Makeda is possibly Kerbet al-Qom, and the cave with a whole bunch of rocks piled in front of it, and 5 sets of bones inside it. They hadn't found that yet. So it's interesting. I think that these guys, all of these kings, they must have been in one little gaggle, and the only reason I could think that they would do that is because they really didn't trust each other all that much, and they probably didn't want they didn't want one king to give an order of battle to his own people that would have in some way prejudiced or endangered the other armies. And so they decided, well, let's all just stay right here together so we can hear the orders that you guys are giving. They weren't saying that, but I think that stands to reason that they probably didn't trust each other very much. And that's very common. I mean, even during World War II with the Allies, the between the Brits and the French and the Americans and whoever, and especially the Russians, there was a lot of okay, yeah, we're allies, but I don't trust you very much. And there's a famous, absolutely famous or infamous um, rivalry between Montgomery and Patton. That each one of them tried to outdo the other when their egos were just through the roof, and so they were. So that's typical in battle and so forth in these armies, that one's trying to outdo the other one. And so these guys, I think that's one of the reasons that they were all together. And so as it turned out, then they all got captured together and they all then died together. So, but we don't know where the cave is, but they've identified now where they think Makeda is, and it's Kerbet al-Qom. And I think I've got I've got a map later on that kind of shows where that is. So going on, Joshua said, roll large stones onto the mouth of the cave, assign men to guard over them, but don't stay there yourselves. Chase after your enemies and attack them at the rear. Don't let them enter their cities, for Adonai, your God, has given them into your hand. Now, Joshua didn't want to slow down the momentum that he had of his men chasing the enemy, and the idea was to hold these kings and just go ahead and continue the battle, and because Israel was definitely winning, and so they didn't want to give these guys a chance to get back into their walled cities, because let's face it, they were out in the open as a field army, and they didn't have the fortifications to hide behind and all of the things that would have benefited them had they been in their home cities and under siege. So they were basically exposed, and Israel was real good at going after the exposed enemy. So anyway, just a few men could have held up that um, the kings that were barricaded in the cave. So it really wasn't that hard for them to hold them. So once again, we see here, with Joshua saying, Adonai, your God, has given them into your hand. We see that Joshua is encouraging his men that the Almighty was on their side, and the battle had actually been won already. That all they had to do was get out there and execute the plan. And this is one of those cases, I think, where the old saying comes into play that God helps those who help themselves. All right, that's not in the Bible. That's just an old saying. It's right there. It's right there next to cleanliness is next to godliness. So again, not in the Bible, but it's an old saying. So, but this is a case where, they had to get out there and fight because, okay, God said, I'm going to give you the enemy, but he wasn't going to do, even at Jericho. Remember Jericho, they had things that God told them to do. They had to do. They had to go around and march around and shout and blow the trumpets and so forth. So it did require action on their part. Anything that God tells us to do these days requires action on our part. So, and okay, great. With our latest edition here, we've reached a minion tonight. So, any comments or questions so far on that? All right, so going ahead. So it was that Joshua and Banay Israel finished striking them with a very great slaughter until they were wiped out, although some of their survivors escaped into the fortified cities. Then all the people returned safely to Joshua in the camp at Makeda. No one dared sharpen his tongue against Banay Israel. Okay, there you go. So Joshua, he didn't want to lose this momentum, so they kept on pursuing. And again, these guys were out in the open, so it was easy. And plus, God was raining hailstones from the sky onto them and killing them that way. So basically, Joshua was saying, okay, I'll deal with these kings later on after we finish the battle. And so then the Bible says that that no one dared sharpen his tongue against Bnei Israel. What that means is that okay, there was no more any opposition. Nobody would even talk about going against Israel. It's one of those things of you say, don't even think about it, and that's where they're saying, don't even talk about going against Israel down here in the south, because it's not going to end well for you. And so this is it's a summary of all of the battles that they had. Uh, and again, these are with the armies that were field positioned, and they were wiped out. Then later on, we're going into the walled cities, and they will take the walled cities. But for the most part, that already wiped out their armies. So taking the walled city was not all that difficult for them. In fact, they would come up to them, and normally a siege could last for weeks, days, weeks, months. But in fact, in a few cases, sieges lasted years. But here, all of these guys were going in. They were going up against these walled cities, and the walled cities were falling within one day. Only Lachish was, I think it was 2 days that it occurred, or it took to wipe that one out. So this, let's see, a few people did escape and got into their their fortified cities, so they thought that they would be safe in there. But anytime you got a battle like that you're going to have some people are going to look at this and um, and they're gonna bail out. They're gonna run. They're gonna hide. They're gonna somehow get out of the battle when they see that it's all lost and they don't want to die. That is a natural reaction, and you can't really fault somebody for that, I suppose. But except for if there's so many of them that do that, then sure they're going to lose the battle. So, but it happens throughout history. I mean, there were eyewitnesses at the Alamo. Now, granted, it was a woman and a child, and I believe an elderly black man that were not killed at the Alamo, and then also at Little Bighorn. There were people, certainly not the ones that were with Custer, that survived it, but there was another flanking army over on another hill that they could actually see what was going on there with Little Bighorn, and when they saw that they were all slaughtered with Custer there, they decided, okay, well, we're not going to go over there and do very well against the Indians. So they hightailed it, but they did see the battle. So, all right. So there we go. There we go. I don't know what I did. All right. So anyway, that was they finished off the all of these guys, and that was kind of a summary. And then it said all the people returned safely to Joshua in the camp at Makeda. All right, now when it says all the people returned safely, and I think it must mean that all the people who had not fallen on the battlefield, because to me it's unreasonable, even though the Bible didn't say they went in there with 30,000 troops, and then they came back they lost 137 soldiers. It doesn't say that. No, there was no mention at all of Israelite casualties. But to me, I think it's unreasonable to think that in any kind of a battle that you're not going to have some casualties on the Israelite side. But there again, the Bible is silent on it. Just because it's silent doesn't mean it didn't happen. That's just the way it is. All right. Any comments? All right.
Rabbi.
Yo.
We had a saying in the Navy, because I was a pilot. The saying went, "He who fights and runs away lives to fight another day."
Yep. And a lot of times there is no reason other than bravado or whatever the deal may be to stick it out and against all odds, you're just gonna do or die. You're gonna die, and yeah, I have to think that there may be some merit into a strategic retreat. All right, and
yeah, the Navy didn't think too much of you losing one of their airplanes for no good reason.
Right. Yeah, those things they're a tad on the expensive side. So anyhow, going ahead here, then Joshua said, "Open the mouth of the cave and bring out those 5 kings to me from the cave." So they did so and brought out those 5 kings to him from the cave, the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon. All right, so these cities were named specifically because it's to emphasize for the reader the magnitude of the victory, and kind of also encompass and give them an idea of how much land had been taken by Israel at this point. So they mentioned all of these names of the various cities, and in fact, all of them then were conquered, except that they didn't mention conquering Jerusalem or Jarmuth, and it doesn't even, again, it's silent as to why it didn't happen that way. So we can maybe assume that they did not sack Jerusalem, and they just left it intact. I'm not real sure on that. So, but something that we got to think about here. Okay, when the battle was concluded, Joshua then he turns his attention back to these captured kings. Now, back in those days, there was a different code of conduct and basically different rules of engagement than we have today. We could probably not have won the war with our rules of conduct, our rules of war, and our rules of engagement, because nowadays, if you're swinging your sword, you might have to ask them first, does this offend you that I'm hitting you with this sword? And if it does, then you have to stop. But back in those days, it was winner take all, no quarter, and it was whoever could swing his sword the biggest and baddest won. And so anyway, they were able to capture these 5 kings, and so actually that was a big deal, capturing all these 5 kings, because that's about like, heck, if you're in a chess game, that you were able to capture the king, the queen, and a couple of bishops, and maybe a knight. And so, I mean, you do all of those kind of things, you seriously hamstring the enemy. And a lot of times, when the enemy sees that their leader or their king or whatever has been captured, killed, whatever, then they're leaderless, because in many cases, they're not used to giving orders and making up with an order of battle on their own, because they're just told what to do. That's one of the things that in the Cold War, the Russians constantly complained about, that in the field, they had all of our manuals and everything that as to how we would look at different scenarios with war and this and that and the other. And so, but they would complain that very difficult to go against Americans, because when something that happens that's not in the book, the Americans don't fall apart, or if they lose their officers, then the sergeants take up the gauntlet, and they are allowed to think for themselves. Our troops are always allowed to think for themselves that, okay, if it all goes south on you, then you have an opportunity to go out there, and if this will save the day, and you don't have any officers over you, and so forth, you don't give up. You keep on fighting, and you make the rules as you go. And we got some very, very talented NCOs in the United States military that I guarantee you, some of those old chief petty officers that I had on my ships, they could probably run that ship just as well as I could. So that was a big deal back in those days, because many armies depended on their leadership, their king, and once the king was lost, then the battle was lost. And so, all right, going ahead, unless there's any other comments, questions on that.
I was just going to say, Rabbi, that I never had a problem with the Master Chief telling me what to do.
I guarantee you, one of the things that when I got out of the academy, one of the things that my dad told me, he said, at graduation, they're there at graduation. He said, "Now, son, when you go to that first ship," and he said, "one of the things that you need to do is make sure that you listen to what your chief petty officers say, because yeah, they'll give you some guff and they'll kid with you and this and that and the other. But he said there's a wealth of knowledge there, and if you will make friends with your your chiefs, or at least let them know that you respect their opinion, you will go far. And it was very good advice, because I listened to my chiefs, and they gave me good advice, and it served me all the way up through the ranks until I retired out. So anyhow, let's go on before we start into war stories. Well, wait a minute. This is a war story, isn't it? Okay. Joshua said when they brought out those kings to Joshua, Joshua summoned all the men of Israel and said to the chiefs of the men of war who had gone with him, "Come forward and put your feet on the necks of these kings." So they came forward and put their feet on their necks. And when Joshua said to them, "Never fear or be dismayed, Chazak, be strong, for thus will Adonai do to all your enemies whom you will fight." Okay, now I got this cool picture that I didn't know Joshua had such a luxurious beard, and but they've got all of these guys, these kings, laying there, and they put their foot up on their neck. And what this really, I don't know if they were laying face down or face up or however they were, but um, this was a gesture. This was a ritual of humiliating the the leader of a defeated army, and it was common practice back in those days. And there was, there was none of the chivalry of allowing the officers, like in the American Civil War, they allowed the officers of the Confederacy uh, to keep their weapons and their swords and their sidearms after they were defeated in the American Civil War. Now, no, none of that kind of stuff here. These Amorite kings were brought before Joshua bound, and the Israelite commanders were then ordered to put their foot on the neck of the defeated king. So I think what it amounts to is that these guys were probably over on their face, and then the leaders of the Israelite army could come over there and kind of stomp on the back of their neck, and grind their face into the dirt. And it's like, man, see that, and take that, you dastardly villain. And, that's part of what they did back in those days. And so it's just, today, in today's world, we would look at that and say, well, that's a guy against the code of whatever, what the rules of engagement is what I'm trying to think of. And so then, but that's what they did back in those days. And then Joshua encouraged his men. He said, "Don't be afraid." Again, he's telling them, "Don't be afraid now. Take courage and be strong, because God has promised to do the same thing to all of the enemies of Israel." So they, went through this ritual. Now I don't know if they had more than five leaders, or however they had Israel divided up. Probably maybe 12 leaders, because they had 12 tribes out there on the field, and we don't know. I don't know. It doesn't say. It just says that they brought the leaders in and said, "Put your foot on their neck," and so that's what they did. And I thought that was kind of a cool picture. And they were given that, I think, to maybe perhaps they were told to do this to give them a little bit more encouragement and confidence, and there's also there's always a lot of these guys, they were still, even though they had fought battles in the last few days, they were still new to war. These some of these leaders in the Israelite army, they had not been brought up in as a as a soldier. A lot of these guys were citizen soldiers, so I think this was an opportunity and then for them to kind of get in there and get the old blood rolling, and then the juices flowing, and that adrenaline up, and it was kind of a pep rally for these guys. Now maybe that's wrong. I'm not sure, but anyway, that's kind of what it appears to me that would be. So, all righty then. After this, Joshua struck them and put them to death. Then he hanged them on 5 trees, and they remained hanging on the trees until evening. And it came about at sunset that Joshua commanded that they be taken down from the trees and thrown into the cave where they had hidden themselves. Then they placed large stones at the mouth of the cave, which are there to this very day. Of course, this very day was at the writing of the book of Joshua. And on that day, Joshua captured Makeda and struck it and its king with the edge of the sword, putting it and every soul in it under a ban of destruction, leaving no survivors. And so he did to the king of Makeda as he had done to the king of Jericho. Now, Joshua himself did the killing. He did not ask his men to do it. He didn't, bring in an executioner. It said that Joshua struck them. He himself killed each one of these guys. Now, one of the commentators said, "Well, that's to show his courage," and I'm not sure that running a sword through a man that's tied up or laying on the ground, it shows courage, but it does. And I really don't think that's what it was. I think he was showing his command and his authority, and just letting people know that he was the baddest dude in town. And so um, maybe somebody's got some other ideas on what this may have meant or what it may have done, but that's my feeling on it, that he was doing this to just let his people know, his kings know, that hey, yeah, you know what, I am tough and I'm ruthless and I'm going to kill all these guys just like that. So maybe I'm off base there. I really don't know, but then they were hung on the trees. They hung them up. Now we don't know if they were just hung by the neck. A lot of times when it says they hung somebody, they would take them, run them through with a sword or with a spear up through the rib cage, and they were impaled and hung on the shaft of the wooden javelins or so forth. And that was also referred to in some cases as being put on a tree. But then they were told to, in the absence of all that, it says they were hung on trees. So I'm just going to say, okay, that's what the Bible says. They were hung on trees, okay? Then it said they took the bodies off the trees and threw them back into the cave, and then they covered it up because they said they didn't want to defile the land with these guys hanging overnight. And so then to add insult to injury, right after that, the fortress there at Makeda, it was destroyed. It was breached and destroyed. So that kind of ended that chapter right there. All right. Any comments, questions?
Rabbi, it's one thing to kill a man that's trying to kill you, but to kill a man that's unarmed is very difficult. And And my thought about Joshua doing that was to let him know that he was only doing it in obedience to God, that it wasn't something that he was really excited about.
Yep, I cannot imagine being in that position. You're right. I mean, the idea of shooting back at somebody that's shooting you, I don't have a bit of problem with that. That's no big deal. But somebody that's already subdued and they are no longer a threat to you, but then you go up there and run a sword through them. That is very, very difficult to do unless you're just the most hardened psychopath out there or something. I think anybody with any kind of a conscience, that would be very difficult for them to do. And um, I'll just leave it at that.
The other thing that I was going to mention is that this was an act of capital punishment, and Joshua had the authority to execute because it was ordained on him by God, but he had the authority to carry out capital punishment.
Right. Well, and these guys, we got to remember that this was not Israel making up the rules. God was the one that said, these people are under judgment. I'm just going to use Israel as the hammer. Israel's going to be the one that's going to carry out the judgment. But it was God's judgment. It was not something that Israel decided, hey, let's just go out there and kill a bunch of men, women, and children and all of their goats and sheep and camels. No, it was definitely God's judgment because of the rampant sin in the Canaan area. And so that's what it was. It was judgment, and Israel acted as the executioner, as it were. So that's exactly right. So when Joshua went up there and killed him, it wasn't murder. He was carrying out the sentence that the Almighty had already pronounced on these guys. All right, so then they took the fortress at Makeda that same day, and then there again, all the inhabitants were killed. Then from there, let's go ahead. Then Joshua and all of Israel with him passed on from Makeda to Libnah and fought against Libnah. Now Adonai also gave it with its king into the hand of Israel. And so he struck it and every single soul in it with the edge of the sword, leaving no survivors in it. So he did to its king as he had done to the king of Jericho. So here again, we see Libnah was the next city state that was under God's judgment, and the role or the result was the same. There were no survivors. Israel went in there and then killed everything that breathed. Now, there's a Hebrew word here, hakarim, actually, and that's the word for the utterly destroyed, and it's the same word that was used back in Jericho. Now you remember that when God told him to take Jericho, he said, "I want you to take this, but this is a conquest. This was for me." And so all of the gold, silver, precious stones, bronze, clothing, all that kind of stuff, that went to the temple and for temple service. And then later on at some of the other battles that Israel was involved in, let's say at Ai, they were allowed to then take the booty, as it were. And in this case, it appears that the wording here, where they use Hakarim, would indicate that possibly they were doing the same thing and taking all of the gold, silver, precious stones, and clothing and so forth, and dedicating that to the Lord, to temple service. But the way it's written there, it talks about, and he did to the king the same thing that he did to the king of Jericho. And so we're kind of left a little bit up in the air, in that he may not have, or they may have allowed the soldiers then to go in there and take booty from, basically the spoils of war, and take it from these city states. I don't know, and so I would certainly not build any doctrine on that. I did want to point out this this map over here that we've got, that it's shows the relative position of the different cities. They've gone from Libna, from Makeda down here to Libna, and the next one was going to be Lachish, and Eglon, Hebron, Debir, and then on back up to Gilgal. So going ahead with verse 31, keep this one in your mind as to where those things are, because you see where Jerusalem is here, and this gets on down. You get down to Debir, and it's getting kind of dangerously close to the Negev desert and the wilderness. Okay, now there's a picture of some of the ruins at Libna, along with the geologists that were laying down on the job, as it were. So, but this is some of the ruins from Libna, and doing archaeological digs and so forth is just really interesting stuff. If you've never had a chance to do that, see what you could do sometime to do that. It's a lot of fun, a lot of fun. So let's see, we got, yeah, I think I've captured all my points there. That the victory was absolutely complete. There were no survivors. So then Joshua and all Israel with him passed on from Libnah to Lachish, camped against it, and fought against it. And Adonai delivered Lachish into the hand of Israel. So he captured it on the second day and struck it, and every single soul in it, with the edge of the sword, just as he had done to Libnah. And then Horam, king of Gezer, came to help Lachish, but Joshua defeated him and his people until he had left him no survivors. Then Joshua and all Israel with him passed on from Lachish to Eglon, and camped against it and fought against it. They captured it on on that day that they executed these kings, and struck it, and with every single soul in it, they basically killed everybody, putting them under the ban that day, just as he had done to Lachish. All right, now I think the important point. Okay, there's a little graphic there that shows going against. There's the conquest of Lachish. Now, for the life of me, I can't figure out how they figured out what that stuff is about. But anyway, they guys with a bunch of that they're a bunch of PhDs. They figured that stuff out. Good on them. So the important point in verse 32 to me is that Adonai, who delivered Lachish into the hand of Israel, it was not Joshua nor the might of Israel. It was Adonai that did that. And this city is especially fortified, and it took 2 days to overwhelm it and destroy it. So this one was a little bit tougher. You know, that's, and there's Lachish. I tell people all the time, you know, that the difficult I can do quickly. I can do that almost immediately. The impossible takes me a moment longer. Now, that's back in the old days. Nowadays, I just tell everybody that I can still do most everything that I used to, but I just do it slower. That's all. All right. So anyway, here's a picture of Tel Lachish, and there were other pictures that I discovered right before I came online. I didn't have time to put them in, but they have these magnificent big Solomon type gates on them, and they're really, really cool looking. All right, now it took 2 days to defeat Lachish, and then this Horam, king of Gezer, some old geezer decided to aid Lachish, but was defeated. And then also Eglon was annihilated. And there is a picture of Eglon. Okay, everybody see what that one is. All right. So, any comments, questions? Go ahead.
All right. Good evening, Rabbi Shrek. I hope I'm pronouncing it right.
That's close enough.
Okay. Yeah, I kind of have a question about how we need to kind of deal with the issues of enemies, because when I see scriptures with the way God allowed the children of Israel to deal with their enemies, it was basically always going to be bloody. So my question is, how, and now in the New Testament, God says, love your enemies. So I don't know, how does that play into, how we need to deal with God saying that the weapon of our warfare, they are not carnal, that they are mighty in pulling down strongholds. So what would you say about people who want to physically protect themselves or their household with guns, just in case there's a break-in or anything, then they shoot?
Okay. Couple of things. When Yeshua was leaving the earth, he got with his people and he said, okay, all of you guys, if you don't, he said, times are dangerous. If you don't have a sword, buy a sword. And if you don't have enough money to buy a sword, then sell your cloak, which was a big deal, and buy a sword. And he was telling them, I want you to be armed so that you can defend yourself. And so I believe that defending yourself is a very, very valid thing. And especially when it's your family, it's a mitzvah. You have to defend your family. And if you, if your hands are lethal weapons, then, go for it. But I've never found lethal weapons that can trump a 45. And so I think that people in today's world, there's nothing wrong with keeping guns in their house if they want them. And so that's good. But now we have to remember, back when Israel was going through Canaan, this was a land that God had promised to Israel, but it was also a case of these people who were residents of Canaan were under judgment. And God had already said to them, you guys are so evil, you're so filthy, you're beyond salvaging. So, your penalty, what did I say yesterday? The wages of sin is death. All right. And so that's what God has said. You have sinned so much that it's payday now, and you're going to be, you know, you're going to have to pay in death. And so God was using Israel then to exact that judgment. And that's all they were. They were employees of God doing what God told them to do, to go in there and kill anything and everything. Because I can imagine that the Israelites would have had a very difficult time with killing children. I mean, that would be something for myself. I am so thankful that I never had to do that. Um, all of my adversaries were seasoned adversaries, and when I was in the service, and so the idea of dispatching them was never a real problem because they were evil people. And so I just look at these things. This is a case of where God was telling Israel, okay, this is what I want you to do to carry out my judgment against the people in Canaan.